This is not how resource wars begin. There are no armies massing at borders, no pipeline explosions captured on satellite imagery, no emergency declarations broadcast across news networks. Instead, sovereignty asserts itself through regulatory frameworks, through the quiet refusal to sign diversion agreements, through legislation that treats water as heritage rather than commodity without announcing that the entire foundation of continental resource assumptions has shifted. Most people believe Canada's rejection of American water access represents environmental policy, a dispute over ecological preservation, Indigenous rights, sustainable resource management. The language reinforces this interpretation. Watershed protection, aquifer preservation, transboundary water governance, the vocabulary of conservation rather than geopolitical rupture. History understands differently. When Mark Carney's government formalized Canada's position that freshwater resources would not be exported to address American water scarcity, it was not implementing environmental protection. It was drawing a line that redefines which resources remain subject to continental sharing agreements and which resources Canada controls absolutely, regardless of American needs or American pressure. The distinction matters because it establishes a precedent that extends far beyond water to encompass every resource that American planning assumes will remain accessible. To grasp what has occurred, we must first examine the nature of water dependency in ways that transcend the statistics about rainfall deficits and aquifer depletion. Water is not like oil or minerals or agricultural products that can be sourced from multiple suppliers through market mechanisms. Water exists in specific places, flows through specific watersheds, accumulates in specific aquifers that took millennia to fill. When those sources become inaccessible, there are no alternatives that can be purchased at higher prices or secured through diplomatic arrangements with distant suppliers. The American Southwest has operated for decades on the assumption that water scarcity represented a manageable engineering challenge rather than an absolute constraint on economic activity. When the Colorado River Basin could no longer support the agricultural production and urban development that had been built around it, American planners assumed that water could be redirected from regions with surplus to regions experiencing deficit. The assumption was not unreasonable given historical patterns, where water had been treated as a continental resource to be managed through interstate compacts and international agreements. Canada possesses approximately 20% of the world's freshwater resources. The Great Lakes system, the largest surface freshwater system on Earth, sits on the Canadian-American border. Canadian rivers flowing north carry volumes that dwarf the entire flow of the Colorado River system. Canadian aquifers remain largely untapped, while American groundwater reserves face depletion that will take centuries to reverse even if extraction were to stop immediately. The geographic asymmetry is so pronounced that American water planners have, for generations, viewed Canadian water resources as the obvious solution to American water scarcity. According to early indicators from Canadian resource ministries, this assumption died in a legislative chamber in Ottawa when regulations were formalized that categorically prohibit bulk water exports, regardless of compensation offered or diplomatic pressure applied. The framework treats water not as a resource to be allocated through economic mechanisms, but as a sovereign national asset that cannot be commodified under any circumstances. This represents a fundamental rejection of the continental resource sharing model that has structured North American economic integration since the middle of the 20th century. The timing reveals strategic calculation. These regulations were implemented during a period when American water crisis was transitioning from theoretical long-term concern to immediate operational constraint. California's agricultural sector, producing approximately 40% of American fruits and vegetables, faces irrigation restrictions that threaten production viability. Arizona's urban centers have implemented emergency water conservation measures. Nevada's gaming and hospitality industries, built around Las Vegas in one of the driest regions of North America, confront water allocations insufficient to sustain current development patterns. This matters because water scarcity, unlike most resource constraints, creates cascading failures that cannot be managed through price adjustments or technological substitution. When agricultural irrigation becomes unavailable, crops fail regardless of how much capital farmers are willing to invest. When urban water systems face supply restrictions, population centers cannot function regardless of conservation technologies implemented. When industrial processes requiring water inputs lose access to sufficient quantities, production stops regardless of economic incentives to continue operations. Draft assessments from American water resource agencies suggest the scale of potential disruption exceeds anything experienced during previous drought cycles. The Department of Agriculture projects that sustained water scarcity in the Southwest could reduce American agricultural output by values exceeding $200 billion annually. Urban planners in water-stressed regions are developing scenarios for managed population relocations if water supplies cannot be secured. Energy sector analysts warn that thermoelectric power generation, which depends on water for cooling systems, faces capacity constraints that could trigger regional electricity shortages. The Canadian refusal to provide water access transforms these projections from planning scenarios into certainties. Without access to Canadian water resources, there is no mechanism through which American water-stressed regions can offset the deficits they face. The engineering solutions that American planners have proposed, massive desalination facilities along coastal regions, water recycling infrastructure for urban centers, require capital investments measured in trillions of dollars and implementation timelines spanning decades. The water crisis is immediate. The solutions, even if fully funded and politically viable, remain generations away from operational capacity. This is where leverage quietly changes hands. For generations, Canada has operated within a continental framework where American economic needs determined Canadian resource policy. When American industries required Canadian timber, Canadian forestry policy adjusted to ensure supply. When American energy markets needed Canadian oil, Canadian petroleum extraction ramped up to meet demand. When American consumers wanted Canadian hydroelectric power, Canadian provinces built dams and transmission infrastructure that prioritize American market access. If the current trajectory holds, this dynamic inverts. As American water scarcity intensifies and Canadian refusal to export water becomes absolute policy, Washington faces constraints that Canadian decisions determine but American pressure cannot modify. The agricultural production that feeds American population centers depends on water that flows through Canadian territory. The urban development that structures American economic geography depends on aquifer systems that extend across the Canadian border. The industrial capacity that underpins American manufacturing depends on water inputs that Canadian policy now treats as non-negotiable sovereign resources. The strategic calculation becomes different for every American sector that depends on water availability. Agricultural companies that built production capacity in water-stressed regions on the assumption that Canadian water would eventually become available through negotiated access agreements now face stranded assets that cannot be relocated or repurposed. Real estate developers who constructed urban communities in desert regions on projections that water infrastructure would expand to meet demand confront property valuations, collapsing as water restrictions make continued habitation unsustainable. Energy companies that invested in power generation facilities requiring water cooling systems face decommissioning costs and lost capacity that cannot be recovered through alternative technologies. Unconfirmed reports from trade negotiators suggest American officials have attempted to frame water access as a continental security issue, arguing that American economic stability serves Canadian interests and that water export should be understood as strategic partnership rather than commercial transaction. Canadian responses, according to these accounts, have been unambiguous. Water is not subject to trade negotiations, not available for purchase regardless of compensation offered, not open to discussion as a bargaining element in broader diplomatic agreements. This represents more than resource nationalism. It establishes a framework where Canada determines which resources remain subject to continental integration and which resources Canada controls absolutely. The precedent extends beyond water to encompass critical minerals, rare earth elements, freshwater fisheries, Arctic shipping routes, any resource where Canadian control could provide leverage over American economic or security interests. By drawing an absolute line on water exports, Canada signals that resource access will be granted on Canadian terms or will not be granted at all. The secondary effects cascade through systems that American planners did not anticipate affecting Canadian leverage. When American agricultural regions face water-driven production declines, Canadian agricultural exports capture market share in sectors where American producers previously dominated. When American urban centers implement water restrictions that constrain population growth, Canadian cities with abundant water access become attractive destinations for businesses and residents seeking sustainable long-term locations. When American energy sectors face water-related capacity constraints, Canadian hydroelectric exports command premium prices from customers who have no alternatives. This is not a crisis, it is a reordering. American communities facing water rationing experience this as immediate hardship. American industries shutting down due to insufficient water access understand this as economic catastrophe. But from the structural perspective that defines how power actually moves between nations, this represents the emergence of a resource constraint that American capital cannot overcome and American diplomacy cannot negotiate away. The infrastructure investments reveal how permanent this shift has become. Canadian provinces are expanding water treatment capacity for domestic use, rather than building export infrastructure. Canadian agricultural regions are increasing irrigation-dependent crop production, knowing that American competitors will face escalating water constraints. Canadian urban planners are approving development projects that assume long-term water abundance, while American counterparts implement restrictions on new construction in water-scarce regions. The timing connects to broader patterns of Canadian strategic repositioning across multiple resource sectors simultaneously. The refusal to export water follows the beef import restrictions that disrupted American agricultural trade, the defense procurement diversification that reduced military dependency, the critical mineral processing requirements that captured value from resource extraction. Each decision individually defensible as domestic policy priority. Collectively, they represent the systematic dismantling of every assumption that American planning has relied upon regarding Canadian resource availability. American water policy has no effective response because the standard mechanisms of resource diplomacy have been rendered inoperative. Threatening trade restrictions becomes meaningless when Canada has diversified its export markets beyond American dependence. Offering compensation for water access fails when Canadian policy treats water as non-commodifiable regardless of price. Appealing to alliance relationships and shared security interests produces no leverage when Canadian positions are framed as absolute sovereignty over national resources rather than negotiable policy preferences. The geographic reality reinforces Canadian advantages in ways that American pressure cannot overcome. Water flows north through Canadian rivers. Aquifers replenish in Canadian territory. Precipitation falls on Canadian watersheds. The hydrology does not care about economic needs or diplomatic relationships or historical patterns of resource sharing. Water exists where it exists, and increasingly it exists in Canadian territory, while American regions face scarcity that no amount of capital or political will can reverse. History does not reverse because it is misunderstood. The American regions built on assumptions of water availability will not regain access through policy changes or trade negotiations. The infrastructure designed around water abundance will not be retrofitted to function with scarcity. The economic geography structured around the belief that Canadian resources would always be available has become obsolete, and the systems will not reorganize themselves to restore arrangements that served American interests at Canadian expense. By the time American resource planners fully comprehend what has occurred, the reordering will be complete, not through dramatic confrontations or resource wars, but through the quiet assertion of sovereignty over resources that American planning assumed would remain accessible. The junior partner in continental resource systems will have become something different, not hostile, not isolated, but sovereign over its own resource decisions in ways that Washington can no longer influence through economic pressure or diplomatic leverage alone.